are and where you're from. If you're attending with one or more people, please let us know how many other people are in the room with you today. I'm Bonnie Weddle. I am the coordinator of the Electronic Records Unit at the New York State Archives and the co-chair of the Coastal State Electronic Records Initiative's Education and Programming Subcommittee. And I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which focuses on developing processing workflows for electronic records. Today's webinar concludes our fall 2019 slate of webinars, but our spring 2020 series begins on January 14th, when the South Carolina Department of Archives and History discusses how it's handling transfers of email in the Microsoft PST format. In February, several members of the National Digital Stewardship Alliance will discuss updates to levels of preservation, the very practical tiered set of recommendations for establishing and developing a digital preservation program, and highlight some new resources developed in conjunction with this revision. In March, we'll hear about how West Virginia University has handled electronic constituent correspondence extracted from multiple proprietary systems and dealt with the privacy and other content concerns inherent in those records. West Virginia University is working with congressional representative correspondence, but this ought to be of interest to folks dealing with gubernatorial correspondence, correspondence of attorneys general, and other officials. And in April, a trio of digital archivists will focus on tools and strategies for documenting digital records workflows so that your colleagues and successors will figure out what you've done. I know Nick is going to touch on that today, but in April we will focus exclusively on documentation. The May and June webinars are still under development, but I can tell you that the May webinar will focus on electronic records disaster preparedness and recovery, and that our June offering will focus on the State Electronic Records Initiative itself, so stay tuned. I'd also like to draw your attention to a couple of video resources that SERI has developed. Managing Digital Content is a video series that discusses the core activities associated with digital preservation, which are identification of the digital content you have or will have, selection of content that warrants preservation, storing content appropriately over time, protecting it from inadvertent or deliberate loss or alteration, managing the content over time, and providing access to it. These videos are a modular, self-paced, and always available resource for employees who are new to your organization or to the topic of digital preservation. At the moment, the Utah State Archives is hosting them, but they will move over to COSA's YouTube channel shortly. Secondly, FAQs on BitRot is on COSA's YouTube channel, and it's a very short, very non-technical overview of what BitRot is and how to reduce the risk that it will damage your records. It's suitable not only for State Archives staff, but for agency records creators as well. And be on the lookout for more videos in 2020. We've got a full slate planned, and production is underway, so stay tuned. And now for the matter at hand. Some of you may recall that in April, Nick Connizzo masterfully guided us through the fundamentals of blockchain technology and its record-keeping implications, and we're delighted to have him back. Nick has been a digital archivist for almost a decade, first with George Washington University, then with the state of Vermont. He now works primarily as a consultant focusing on digital preservation, data management, and information governance. He serves as co-chair of the State Electronic Records Initiative's Tools and Resources Subcommittee. I'm now going to turn the floor over to Nick. Please note that we will hold all questions until the end. However, please feel free to enter any questions that come into your mind into the chat box as the webinar progresses, and we'll address them at the end. Hey, and Nick, you should have the slides now.
All right, thank you. If you can hear me okay. I wanted to start by thanking the Council of State Archivists and the State Electronic Records Initiative again for allowing me the opportunity to present on their behalf, and to all you lovely people out there. I know we're kind of getting close to the holidays, so hopefully this one will have a lot of information that you can take back and think about over the next couple weeks before settling back in for the new year. So I hope this one is interesting for you, and I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions. And if you do, just go ahead and put them into the chat, as Bonnie mentioned, and I'll be happy to answer them at the end. So before I start, I wanted to talk a little bit about the genesis of this presentation. My colleagues, Rachel Muse and Zach Whitaker at Best Practices Exchange, before I left the state of Vermont, the state archives there, we were going to give this presentation or a similar one at Best Practices Exchange. And I wasn't able to go, but they kind of gave a similar one and got a lot of great feedback for those of you who were there. We were just just talking about what our digital preservation, our digital processing workflow was and how it kind of came together over the last year or so. So rather than kind of run that back again, a lot of the feedback was, well, how do we actually put this together ourselves? We have all these similar requirements, all these different requirements, different levels of staffing, et cetera. How can we build our own with, all different technology, all different tools? So rather than, again, trying to go back and present to you an in-place processing workflow, I thought, why don't we zoom out and think about the things that matter when it comes to digital processing workflows. So that's what this presentation is going to be about today. It's not really in-depth. It's not going to be really technical, though we will touch on a lot of things. But what I can recommend is over the next year or so, one of the initiatives that SERI is working on is a series of videos. The BitRod is one of them that Bonnie already mentioned, a series of videos that will be talking about a lot of these other topics that I'm going to touch on in depth over the next year or so, a lot about specific aspects of digital processing. So definitely stay tuned, go to the COSA Resource Center, keep up with COSA for those type of things, because this is what we're going to be doing a lot deeper dive on later this year. So hopefully this is, a good taste of what that's going to be like, and also can get you thinking about, how to actually either build these yourselves or refine the ones you already have for improvement. So in scope for today's kind of presentation, I just want to talk about what I mean when I say digital processing. I think we all probably mean similar things if we use this term or not. I'm going to talk about what actually matters, or what I think matters in terms of actually doing your digital processing, and then how do we actually design our process and workflows so that we can turn what matters into what we do. What we're not going to do, I kind of mentioned this already, is I'm not going to do a really detailed, in-depth discussion of tools. I think that I'm not dogmatic about the tools that I use. There are great ones out there, and there will be new ones. there will always be new technologies and tools that we use, but in the end, the purpose of the tool is to get the job done. And so I really believe that we need to figure out what the job is before we select the tool, rather than vice versa. As I will mention some, but I don't think we're going to go deep on those. And then lastly, like I said, I'm not going to try to have a workflow that you can just bring to your institution and adapt by the end of this. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. There's never going to be. There are too many variables that, too many sliders that need to be adjusted. So instead, I'm just going to talk about what I think are really reduced fundamentals, and then hopefully you'll be able to, have the foundation to translate that into your own frameworks at home. So to start pretty simply, what is digital processing? I think that a lot can go into digital processing. Some organizations out there might, have a really discrete process, whereas processing starts when X happens and continues through and ends when Y happens, and then we're not processing anymore. Other institutions might take a more holistic approach and say, hey, if we've got something, we're going to continue working on it forever. Every year, every 5 years, every 10 years, we're going to look back and review the work we've done, see if it's still working or not. Again, there's not really a right or wrong approach. There are bad things to do, but there's not really a correct or incorrect approach. But I think in general, if you really try to reduce it down, what I would say processing is really surveying, arrangement, description, and preservation. So I'm thinking that if you think back to your entry-level courses when you were getting your MLS, or any type of training you've had when it comes to archival science, these are not unfamiliar terms to us. Really what we're talking about, though, is getting from here, which is just a stack of stuff, and replace these floppy disks with hard drives, replace them with a giant directory that somebody transferred to you over the web or however you got it, that is just a mess of files. My favorite are the collections of photographs I feel like we always get that have, the DSC_0641, and there's thousands of photos named in the same way with no context, right? It's getting from that spot to this spot. This is just, what the National Archives catalog looks like. It's got an image, it's got metadata, it's got provenance, it's got all types of stuff associated with it. And the truth is, somebody had to do a lot of work to get a photograph, whether it was digital or analog, sitting in a box or sitting on a file server somewhere, into a catalog, into a repository, and make it sing, essentially. And regardless of whether we like the music, I think that ultimately all of us want to get to the point where our records are accessible, usable, trustworthy, etc. So how do we actually do that? Again, to put it in super simplistic terms, we get stuff, we figure out what it is, get rid of the stuff that we don't need. Weeding can be controversial from time to time, but we know that as part of the process of making digital records, there are tons of artifacts that are created that are not necessarily necessary from an archival perspective. Add highlight data that already exists, add context, etc., to make it better, make it more discoverable, make it more usable. And then lastly, make sure it sticks around. Make sure the level of use that is appropriate for the records continues into the future. This is pretty much it. This is pretty much what we're talking about. Like I said, there's a lot of room inside of these very simplistic steps to do things. So let's just jump right in. Really, I think the big question that I've been asked a number of times, both as a records management professional and as an archivist, is why? Why is it difficult to translate what we know, what we've been trained, what we've been building up, what we've been viewing webinars for, some of us for decades at this point? Why is it so difficult to translate what we know into what we do? And the truth is that I don't have a great solution for that, but there's an entire set of, I'm going to use the term science, but that is debatable, about management, about process building, about workflow. You might have heard of Lean, Six Sigma, CPI, CQI, Agile, Scrum, et cetera. There's all different types of workflows and frameworks that exist to help translate what do we actually need to do to what are we actually doing. I could never do a full kind of description or breakdown of any of these. There are probably webinar series out there that focus solely on that and have intensive training courses. So if you're interested in seeking that out, find a good one. I'm not going to make any recommendations, but doing this type of work, understanding how business processes work, is extremely invaluable for us in our profession, because this helps us with understanding the provenance of our records. This understands us understanding how our records creators work. And all of those things are necessary for us to do the work of replicating that, right? Understanding our original order. If you can't understand what the original order is or why, it's going to be hard for you to actually faithfully translate that forward through time. So put simply, though, a process really is not that complicated. Again, if you kind of boil it down, just as we boiled down the, what a processing workflow might look like, really a process, lowercase p, is pretty simple. You have input. What do you need to begin the process? You have the various steps that you take as part of the process. These are the things you do. And then the process has an output. What is the product? Additionally, there's some other important things that are part of it. I highlighted roles. There's also tools that might be used. Who does what tools do they use to do it? But really, it's input, process, output. And I think if we think of our workflows in terms of inputs and outputs, that starts to ground us in a really concrete place that we can start building up our frameworks, because we know what we're expecting to get, we know what we're expecting to put out, and then it's just a matter of how do we actually get there in the middle, and I'll explain why we care about and how we figure out how to do that. Again, put pretty simply, we get inputs, and input doesn't have to be something tangible. It can be just information, it can just be knowledge, it can be an acknowledgement, etc. Then we do something, or somebody does something, and then there's an output. It's super simple, but we have to start simple because it starts to get complicated really quickly. One other thing I wanted to touch on when I'm just talking about process in general is that documentation. This was something that Bonnie mentioned. There's going to be a webinar about it later in the year, but documentation in general is really, really essential to successful workflows. And while documentation can be an output of a process. It also should be used to describe the process. The reason that documentation is so important, especially when it comes to digital processing, is that you're not going to be the only person working on this, right? How many times have you come into a situation where you're picking up a project that somebody left off? No documentation. You're taking on a role that, somebody retired or somebody moved on. No documentation for what they were doing, how they were doing it, why they were doing it. That is an information gap, and that's going to cause problems down the road. So having a solid foundation of documentation is going to be really, really important to any process, in my opinion, but especially important to digital processing processes, because we're going to need to kind of break off from our process at several steps and leave a paper trail, so to speak, of what we did, why we did it, how we did it. Because, as probably all of us know, this is not a process that is without errors. This is not a process that is difficult to mess up. It's quite easy to mess stuff up. It's complex. So without good documentation, without good kind of evidence of what you've done, even yourself, you might lose track of what you've been working on if you go on vacation or you're out for a few months. You need to come back to it. So I can't highlight that enough, and I'll be talking about that kind of throughout. But the first thing I want to really talk about is requirements. When you're talking about kind of building workflows or building processes, I think that the entire kind of discipline of business analysis really can be boiled down to finding out what requirements are, working on refining them, determining which ones need to be prioritized over others, and then translating those requirements into actual business process. So I'm going to go to BABOK, which is the Business Analysis Book of Knowledge, which goes into some pretty great depth about how to actually think about requirements when it comes to business processes. But in general, it's a condition or capability needed by a stakeholder to solve a problem or achieve an objective. Again, super, super vague about what it actually is. And, this, speaking from experience, I've worked on big projects, I've worked on small projects. You could have 800 requirements on a project. You could also have 8. You could have fewer than that. You could have more than that. So it really depends who you're working with, what you're working on, what you're trying to accomplish. But I like to view requirements as being hierarchical in nature. There are broad requirements, and to satisfy broad requirements, you have narrower requirements and narrower and narrower. So if you conceptualize it that way, it becomes a little bit easier to understand. But at the end of the day, our requirements, that's really where you're starting from when it comes to building a workflow. What do we actually have to do? And then we kind of figure out the process. If you don't really understand what your requirements are, if you don't really do a good job of soliciting requirements from your stakeholders, if you don't do a good job of articulating your requirements once you do get that information in, your process, your workflow, it's going to be on a shaky foundation because there's already, as you can see, there's already an information gap there. So I would say before you do anything else, really what you're going to want to start with is figuring out what your requirements are. And I'm going to tell you kind of how you can do that. But there's a lot of different strategies. Again, the whole discipline of business analysis has tons and tons to say about requirements gathering. If you ever do, in a public context, if you ever do contracting, every pretty much standard contracting process, I would have to guess around the U.S. is going to have some sort of step that involves requirements gathering and then judgment of what those are. So, if you haven't thought of what you're doing in terms of requirements, I encourage you to start trying to think of it that way. But I wanted to talk about some basic requirements that we might have for the records that we possess. So thinking about, this is really mostly directed at a public record-keeping institution audience, but I think really the concepts apply everywhere. But really what we're looking for, in our records that we have custody over and that we're responsible for preserving and, providing access to, et cetera, looking for a couple of key elements. We want them to be trustworthy. We want people to, be able to look at the records and trust that they were cared for correctly, that they are complete, that they are fully usable. that they are authoritative, that there isn't any doubt about whether these records are legit, where they came from, who made them, etc. There's nothing more frustrating as from the perspective of someone who's, I'm sure you've all done primary source research. There's nothing more frustrating than having a record which seems really interesting, but don't know who made it, don't know what it's from, don't know what the context is. You start to lose a lot of the value of your information very, very quickly if we don't have those things. And more, and I'll get on my little soapbox here for a second, more and more the responsibility of public record keepers is protecting that trust, protecting the public trust. We live in an age where it is extremely easy to make fakes, right? To make fakes of all different types of things. If you've ever kind of been in what's going on in the zeitgeist now is, if you're familiar with the concept of the deep fake, which is, like a video that really can make it seem like someone is saying or doing something that they're actually not. So we live in a world where it's really easy to just make documents, make digital objects, make things that look like authentic records that aren't. It's so easy for me to go and make a memo that looks like it came from the President of the United States and maybe even has a signature that looks legit on it. That doesn't make it a real record, and we all know that. So we are more and more getting into the business of trust, or we should be in the business of trust as much as we are with dealing with the technical difficulties surrounding record keeping and preservation. So I think that that's going to be a key component that you're going to need to build into your workflows, and I'll kind of help you with that, with the frameworks that I always talk about. So if you've seen one of my presentations before, I love ISO 15489. It's records management, records management principles. And really, there are some clear terms that are given in this standard that help us ensure authoritative and trustworthy records. And I use these terms not because they are super specific or really the end-all be-all, but I think they give us a good framework to conceptualize what is important. Remember, we're talking about requirements when it comes to processing and digital preservation. So I think that you're looking at them right here. Your most fundamental requirements are making sure that you are maintaining the authenticity, reliability, integrity, and usability of your records. So I think this makes your baseline set of requirements, and I'll just run through them really quickly. And it's my hope that it'll start to make sense why. Authenticity, really quickly, is a record that is authentic can be proven to be what it purports to be, right? It's created and sent by the agent purported to have created or sent it, and creator sent when purported to. Essentially, this means that if you can prove that a record was made at a certain time by a certain actor, not necessarily a person, could be though, and is what it is claims to be, it's authentic. This one is probably one of our most important requirements, and it's really easy to let this one fall by the wayside. I know that it's probably true for all of us out there that we have accepted accessions or transfers of records that have dubious, let's say, authenticity, right? Someone retires from government and then takes their records later, takes their records with them, and 20 years later, it's like, oh, I have this box in my attic. Here you go. Situations like that happen all the time. But part of our job is going to be, when we're doing our digital processing, is going to be making sure that we can kind of either piece back together or maintain or just capture the information about the authenticity of the record, because a lot of the records that we are tasked with processing and ultimately preserving and providing, a lot of them get used in legal context. A lot of them really need to have their authenticity intact, otherwise they lose value as a legal instrument, and they start to lose value from just an informational instrument as well. Similarly, we care about reliability of records. We want records that are and this one is more about the process of creating the record. We want records whose contents can be trusted as full and accurate representations of transactions, activities, or fact to which they attest, and which can depend on in the course of subsequent transactions. So essentially what that means is we need to understand and know about the circumstances of the creation of the records. bad record creation processes tend to produce bad records. So you can have an authentic record that is definitely produced by a government agency, but if they had a crappy record-keeping process or an inconsistent one, bad software, etc., that record is going to cease, it's going to lose value because it's not reliable. We can't yet, yeah, they made it, but we can't actually trust that it's accurate because of glitches in the system or poor quality control or no standards, no best practices, etc. So a lot of this stuff is, a horses are at the barn door type of situation where by the time we're involved in the processes, there's not really a lot that we can do. But that being said, our job is still to protect and preserve as much of this as we possibly can, right? And if we can rebuild it, and I'll get to why we might have to do that, if we can do that, we should. Next is integrity. A record as integrity has one that's complete and unaltered. There's a lot that goes into making sure our records have integrity. Probably the easiest one that where a lot of us are familiar with is, fixity, checksums, making sure that our records don't get corrupted, that they're not subject to bit rot. Go and watch that video if you're, if you want more detail on that, those type of circumstances. But integrity also means that it has this kind of, entire records life cycle scope to it, where there's a lot of points in the records life cycle that the integrity can be compromised. And once your integrity is compromised, really all you can do from that point forward is say, well, this point we had what integrity we had left, and that's the best we could do. As we move to computing models and information models that feature fewer and fewer kind of unstructured data, so fewer and fewer PDFs, Word documents, stuff sitting on a server, and more of our data is structured in databases and more complex kind of business process or business software that has a lot of data in a lot of disparate places. It's harder and harder for us to maintain the integrity of our records because they're scattered. And if we don't capture all of the important data, we're not going to actually be able to preserve the integrity of our records. And then lastly, accessibility and usability. I think that this is probably the one that a lot of us are, what we highlight during our budgeting process, right? This is the most visible kind of part of our requirements, but people need to actually be able to access the records. People need to actually be able to use the records. It doesn't really help our case if we have records in a file format that is proprietary, that was used in the 90s by a small company, and that company's since gone out of business, and there's no ability for us to read those records anymore, right? If a record can't be read, is it really a record? So I think that this is something that we shouldn't forget, because this is where we're going to have our biggest long-term issues. But a record that is incomplete also has problems with accessibility and usability. Databases, websites, etc. Anything that has linked data in it, it can have serious accessibility issues if those links change, if those links die, etc. So I think that when we're talking about requirements, we're making sure that we have authoritative records as part of our processing process, because ultimately in our repositories, in our archives, we actually want our records to be authoritative, and that's whether we work for government or not. But it's not the only things that we care about. Here's just a summary. Oh yeah, one thing I wanted to say about this, I forgot to mention. I always use a mnemonic. I always just think like, if we go back a couple slides, I had this guy who's kind of like an opera. He's like an old-timey, a tenor from an opera, and I always think ARIA, like authenticity, reliability, integrity, accessibility. So I think of the Aria that we're kind of working with. It's just a mnemonic that I like to use, and I'm going to say it about 50 more times in this presentation. So yeah, be prepared for that. But Aria is not the only requirements we have. We have other ones as well. I mean, just from a pragmatic standpoint, we need our processes, our workflows, they actually have to be doable. They have to be manageable. The number of times that I'm sure you all have been told that here's what your process is going to be, or you've worked on them yourself, and they are they're great on paper, but then when they actually go into practice, they're not actually doable. That's a big issue, and that's something that we actually have to constantly be monitoring is what can we actually do. And then, I talked about documentation already, but especially for public record keepers, it's really important that everything we do is transparent. You feel kind of sometimes that you're working without a safety net if you're just publishing everything that you do out there and all of your processes are transparent and open for people to audit and question and things like that. But in the end, again, like I said 10 minutes ago, really archives, public record keepers, records managers, et cetera, we're moving toward having a bigger slice of this protection of the public trust. And I really think that not only will it help us in our own processes, but it helps people trust records if they can look and see the processes that got records from point A to point B, or really the entire record-keeping lifecycle. If they can audit and kind of know what process is taken, it just helps build that trust, and it helps us find errors in those workflows. So there's other requirements that you're going to have, which is why we're not talking about a specific workflow. There's no one-size-fits-all because you're going to have your own technology limitations. You have to use Microsoft operating systems. You can't use Linux. You have to use, you have to use desktop applications. You can't use command line, etc. There's too many different sliders there for me to be able to say what your tech situation is. So you're going to have your own technological requirements, what you can and can't use. You're going to have specific actor requirements. Who has to be involved in the process? Who has to sign off? Who has to do what? Who has to do, when that has to be done? And that segues into timeframes too, which is some of us can have a processing workflow that, we can take 2 years if we need to. Others have to have a 3-month turnaround or an immediate turnaround or so on and so forth. So, there's, like I said, there's no one-size-fits-all to building this workflow, but what you have to do is figure out what all of your requirements are. I think that the Aria requirements, those are very much universal, but I think that these ones are going to be specific to your organization, your institution, and your designated communities, your co-stakeholders, and you're going to have to work with them to figure out what these are. And that's a difficult process, but hopefully, just being able to think about it in that way can help you kind of have this conversation with others, because if you don't get those requirements down, you're not going to be successful. And so really, kind of segueing into how requirements become your workflow, it's not really that complex, but it's also very complex, right? So I try to make it as basic as possible, which is you start with a requirement, you translate that requirement to a process step or a process, right? How do I actually meet this requirement? Then I select a tool that's going to help me accomplish that. Then I'm going to select a role who's going to perform it. And then the requirement is going to be met, right? So for example, if your requirement is, I'll just take a really simple one, which is I want to make sure that the record that the agency sent me is the record that I receive, right? So what's the process that I'm going to do? Well, the process is going to be I'm going to have them create, fixity, like checksums for all the records, and then whenever they send them to me, I'm going to verify them, right? So that's actually a more complicated than like a one-step process, but ultimately we're talking about how do I do X? Here's my my requirement translated to a process. The tool I'm going to use is Bagger, let's say. Who's going to do it? Well, the agency records officer and myself, we're going to do it. And then hopefully, if it works out, the requirement is met. And then you kind of build that into your workflow. You're going to be doing it with 50 requirements or 100 requirements or however many you can suss out. But I think that that's kind of your basic process for translating those requirements into different workflow steps. So, to keep moving, we're actually going to flow directly into how I might translate the requirements that I've already talked about into a workflow. So like I said, I thought that the Aria requirements are pretty universal. So I went through each of them and said, okay, well, how do I actually translate this into a really, really simplistic workflow that hopefully you can, hopefully it will stimulate your imagination and stimulate, the work that you're doing at your own institution to be able to say, oh yeah, are we doing all these things? Are we actually meeting these requirements? So again, we go back to our basic processing workflow, right? Get stuff, figure out what it is, weed what isn't needed, add or highlight metadata to make it more usable, and make sure it sticks around. So I wanted to start, whoops, what did I do here? I wanted to start with a note on records transfers. So I usually consider records transferring records to be outside of processing, but I mean, let's be realistic. We don't work in a vacuum. You know, there is no such thing as living outside of the records life cycle. So from records creation all the way to ingest, deposit, and archive, there's a bunch of different record steps. And at some point, records are going to be transferred from one custodian to another. There's, you know, a couple different ways that can happen. There's single transfers, you know, term ends, somebody retires, a program is terminated, etc. There's regular/ongoing transfers, which are, you know, we get a yearly transfer from this agency or that agency to add to a certain set of records. And then there's the one that I'm sure we deal with all the time, which is the kind of unscheduled, unexpected, or emergency transfers because the roof on this building collapsed or such and such happened and this agency lost their funding or these two agencies got merged and so on and so forth. There's all different ways that we get records. So I don't necessarily say that they're part of the processing workflow, but obviously, you know, we already talked about inputs and output. The output of the transfer process is going to be the input of your processing process. So there's no such thing as us saying we don't care about that. There's no such thing as a process and a workflow that kind of lives in isolation. So the outputs of some processes are going to be the inputs of others. So you're going to have to be working with your records creators on records transfer processes that actually give you the inputs that you need to actually be able to do the processing. Or, you know, at the very least, give you the inputs you need so you can make the records that you're going to process actually successful. And I can definitely say that as part of the that video series I was talking about before for SERI, there's going to be a bunch of stuff on records transfers. I don't think it's been published yet, but there's a series working on a records transfer checklist that you know, you can see if you're on the right track when it comes to actually making sure everything you have to do as part of transfers. So check the COSA Resource Center for some more information on this. There's a lot of good stuff there, which is part of the reason I'm not talking about it. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we don't control our records creators. So we don't, and most of us, I assume, we might have influence in various different ways, so either by policy or by being really nice or, you know, demonstrating that we have the right know-how, we have the tools, and we have the techniques to be able to do this. But, you know, remember that the folks who are records creators might not be computer experts, probably not going to be, not necessarily going to be fully knowledgeable about their records. They definitely won't be fully knowledgeable about the entire record-keeping lifecycle and kind of the entire scope and context of their records within kind of the broader institution that they're working for. So, and the truth is, even if you did, and even if you could tell them what to do, what you're going to get as part of your transfer, what you're going to get coming out of content management systems or document management systems or productivity systems or whatever, you know, tools that the records creators have at their disposal is not going to be exactly what you want. So how do you actually deal with that? Well, I think that having a simple, straightforward workflow to be able to kind of deal with a lot of different shaped collections, a lot of different contextualized record sets that come in, having some flexibility is going to be pretty helpful. And not being too specific, but being specific enough, if that makes sense. Hopefully that will make a little more sense as we progress. So again, if we go back right to our really basic workflow, it's get stuff, figure out what it is, get rid of what we don't need, add more context and more metadata, and then actually preserve, right? So I've broken them down into 4 different phases: surveying, arrangement, description, and preservation. All of you, I'm sure, have heard all those terms before. Again, I'm not claiming that these are not copyrighted terms, but what I'm trying to do is give you a framework for how I think that it could work. And really the first part is just surveying, figuring out exactly what you have. So I've tried to take these requirements and actually turn them into process steps. So Your requirement is to maintain the authenticity of the records. So what you should be doing during your surveying process, right, this is an information gathering step, is figure out as many details of the records creation use as possible, what software it came from, what system it came from, who made it, when they made it, what it was used for, etc. Your next requirement is making sure your records are reliable. So gather information on the processes themselves, not necessarily the systems, not necessarily the authenticity, but what program was it created as part of? If you're working for a public agency, what laws, what laws govern the programs that are actually creating these records? Why is this record? Why is this information being collected or created? Then when it comes to integrity, you can gather information on the completeness of the records. If there was 60 information provided, you can verify it, right? You can also, if there isn't any, you could create some yourself. It really is going to depend on what you can do and how much access you have. And then lastly is accessibility, where there's, probably countless accessibility factors, but just a few of them off the top of my head were, what file format is it in? Is it encrypted or not? Are there any legal requirements on these records, exemptions or anything like that? Personally identifiable information, personal health information, anything that would be covered by, personal privacy type of laws, things like that. Is any of the information about these records human readable, right? Is it actually going to be used? So I think that because phase one is really all about gathering information, I think it makes the most sense to talk about what this basic process looks like in terms of our input, process, output. And I'm going to do this for all of our different phases, which I'm going to move pretty quickly through. But really our input for the basis for the surveying is the records transfer. We get the records transfer. Our process is surveying, pre-processing. This is kind of doing all your information gathering. And our output is various. There's various different outputs. And those outputs could be, when you're talking about authenticity, you're talking about a verification, right? You get the records from the records creator and you say, yep, we got them. We've checked their fixity. They're not corrupted. They weren't damaged in transfer. We have a copy. There's a signed custody transfer that actually can officially and legally transfer the custody of the records from the records creator to your institution. There also might be a fail-safe. You might want to create multiple copies or multiple images of the records you've created. Some will be stored just in case there's a catastrophe at some point. Others can be given to processing archivists or whoever, those become the inputs of the next phase. I'm not going to go through necessarily all of these, but I think you're probably starting to get what the basic process here is, which is figure out what your requirements are, think about them in terms of process step, and then what are the outputs from these different requirements. But what all of this really becomes is a processing package. You've gathered as much information as you can possibly gather, both from the records themselves and also from their creators. And you can create that processing package, which is going to be the input for phase two, which is, I'm calling it arrangement. I'm trying to use our discipline, your traditional arrangement description. But really what we're doing is we're doing a conceptual organization of the records. I also like to include weeding activities as part of this first step. You don't really want to put artifacts that you're not going to keep, duplicate records, things that are not necessary, things that are out of scope, things that are not covered by your transfer agreement, et cetera. You don't want to arrange them. You don't want to describe them. You don't want to do preservation actions on them if you're ultimately not going to keep them. So I think it makes sense to get rid of them as early as possible if you have enough information. But really, again, we're going to do the same thing. We're talking about the requirements for arrangement. We're looking at the same ones. Authenticity, reliability, integrity, accessibility. We want to be making sure that we're preserving as much provenance as possible when we're talking about authenticity. Reliability, we're really talking about original order, understanding, how were these records created and used, and how does that actually going to be reflected in the way that we present these to our designated communities. Again, throughout the entire processing process, you're going to be moving records around, you're going to be adding metadata to them, you might be doing file format migrations, et cetera. You want to make sure that you're not accidentally changing any of the information. So you want to be making sure that the integrity is preserved as much as possible. And then lastly, unlike paper records, with electronic records, a lot of the time you are not locked into a single a single discovery layer. There's lots of different ways that people discover electronic records, whether it's hierarchical navigation or faceted search or whatever it ends up being. You're going to need to figure out in advance what those are going to be. And we do the same thing, right? Our input is our processing package. Our process is our arrangement and weeding. And our output is what our final arrangement is going to be. And this helps us figure out what our outputs are going to be of this phase of our process, which is provenance is clear, unnecessary records are gone, collection, any available metadata that was already provided for us or captured by us as part of the transfer or as part of the arrangement process, it's there. Right? We're making sure to continually verify our records and make sure that their integrity is intact. We're making sure that the structure that we've created for arranging the records is conducive not only to search, but if you have a situation where you have routine transfers or ongoing transfers, or you're recruiting once a month, once a year, et cetera, it needs to be sustainable because you don't want to have to go through this whole process again. And then, at the output phase, I always put transparency as part of it, which is, I think it's really important to start with have a processing plan, have a plan for what you're going to do, and document what you actually do. If you start with a manifest of records from your transferring agency, if you get rid of some of them, have a new manifest of records. Here's what I put as part of my output of phase 2. So if somebody wanted to audit what you're doing, they could say, okay, part 1 had these records, and then part 2 didn't have those records, so those were removed. Why were they removed? Hopefully it'll be very clear in your documentation. It'll be very clear in your reporting why you're doing the things that you're doing, why you're removing the things you're removing, and this is a perfect place for having that great documentation. Then there's description. I said that this is phase 3, which is now that you've got all your, what records you have, they're in the right spots. Now you can add description to them. Our requirements essentially are going to be the same thing, right? Make sure we maintain authenticity, maintain reliability, integrity, accessibility. Ensure that essentially these ones all boil down to ensuring that all of the necessary information translates well through the metadata, whether it's administrative or technical or descriptive or whatever metadata you have, or whatever metadata you create, you actually can transmit this information to your designated community. Again, the basic process is going to be pretty simple. Your input is your records that have been arranged. Your process is description. Your output is going to be records that are arranged and robust metadata. And I did really simplified here, which is essentially we want to have whatever you consider to be a robustness of metadata that you are able to do. Remember, manageability is really important here. I'm sure we would love to all be able to process a photo collection and go in and be able to identify every person in every photo, be able to perfectly date it, be able to say what it is, where it is, what's happening, etc. But we know that that's not always possible. It might be possible in some cases, it might not be possible in others. So we're going to do the best we can, the most that we can manage. But again, still, these are our outputs from this phase, and we still, again, want to be able to document what we've done, have really clear reports and outputs from our processing process, so to speak, that essentially allow people to figure out what we've done. And if you'll notice, at each of these different steps, the reason I've divided into these different phases is that they give you these nice milestones that you can say, okay, we're done with this phase. It's a great place to do a summary. It's a great place to do a processing plan. It's a great place to do a manifest and a report. Build in these moments where you can do documentation as part of your workflow, because you'll be really thankful that you did. It's me. And then the last thing is preservation. This is maybe something that is going to be both during the quote-unquote processing workflow, but also something that you're just going to be doing broadly at your institution indefinitely, right? Your digital preservation, that's part of the reason that we're all here. So part of your process steps, in order to maintain all of these different requirements, we want to make sure we have preservation plans. We want to make sure that we have robust descriptive information. We want to make sure that all of our integrity information is intact and fully transparent so people can verify that. And then if records are no longer accessible because file formats are, not usable anymore, or operating systems are different, or computing environments are different. We need to figure that stuff out. And you'll see our basic process, again, is going to make range from records and metadata coming in. Process is our preservation process, and then our output is the records and metadata plus the preservation information. And the reason that we end up at that output is, hopefully this next diagram is something that is very familiar to all. Whoop, one more slide. One of the things that I'm hoping is that these outputs look familiar to you, because descriptive information, content information, packaging information, preservation information, all of these things are what it takes to make a reliable, trustworthy, and authoritative record. And in fact, that's what the OAIS model expects, right? So remember how I said this entire process, this entire workflow, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. The next, you're just producing an output for the next process. And the next process is preservation of your records in your open archival information system, which, most of us probably have a OAIS compliant repository that we're working with. If we don't, that's okay, because this is going to tell you exactly what you need. You can do it with commercial software. You could do it with a lot of open source tools that you could just run on your own desktop. But essentially, what we're talking about is turning a input, which is a bunch of records from a records creator, into this, which is the output, which is this information object with content information, preservation information, packaging information, descriptive information. That becomes your information package that goes into your repository. So, I think that if you think of your workflow in those terms, where am I going? This is where you're going. And you know where you're starting, which is possibly chaos, possibly some sort of ordered chaos, but really, we all know that no two records creators are alike. So even if we have the best policies, the best procedures in place, even if we say X, Y, and Z, it's not always going to be exactly the same. But hopefully this can help you build a workflow that gets you from that point A to point B. Really, that's kind of where we're going with all this. And I just wanted to add a couple more notes, which is, I really don't believe that there is a single right way to do this, certainly not when it comes to processing, and certainly not when it comes to preservation. There are better things that we can do, but ultimately we're going to be bound by how much we can do. Bonnie mentioned at the beginning, in a couple months, you're going to see the levels of preservation, the NDSA presentation. It's a great way to conceptualize how much you can do, how much you are able to do, because again, we have different staffing, we have different budgets, we have different political situations, we have different knowledge situations, so you're not going to be able to do everything, which is why a one-size-fits-all workflow doesn't work. What you actually need is to look at these basic requirements and build them to your own ability to manage. And the last thing I wanted to say is that, I said survey, arrange, describe, preserve, but that's not gospel. The order is not necessarily as important. Some folks, you might like to do things in a different way, and frankly, your requirements are going to tell you when you have to do things. Those are going to clue you in when things can be done. So one of the things that I just remember anecdotally, we had a conversation about a couple weeks ago in my subcommittee was whether we should expect records creators to do a virus scan before they transfer it to us or after. And the truth is, both would be awesome, right? We would love to expect them to do so, but if their requirements, if they're not going to do it, then that's a requirement you have, which is, my agency is not going to do a virus scan or a malware scan, so I have to do it when the records come in. So, those type of things are going to throw you curveballs. They're going to dictate how you have to do things, and those are going to change. And I think that's the last piece that I wanted to mention, which is, there's a oft-repeated quote, about apocryphal quote from kind of the military, which is, no plan ever survived contact with the enemy, right? Like no amount of workflow that you ever have is going to survive actually having the records in front of you and you having to do it. However, having a workflow that is built off of fundamental principles, right? What do I actually care about? You don't actually need to rigidly stick to your processes, though we want to try whenever we can, but it enables you to, since you know what you care about, you can make calls. You can figure out how to actually act in the places where you don't have policy that necessarily covers it. It allows you to make a broadly applicable policy and procedure that covers a lot of different possible situations rather than a narrow, rigid process that is you're kind of locked in. It doesn't allow a lot of wiggle room. So if there are questions or comments, I know I talk fast. I went through a bunch of different stuff in this presentation. This slide deck, I think, Bonnie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure this slide deck is going to be available on COSA's website. So I know I went through some of those, requirements, process steps really quickly, but again, they're not meant to be, here's what you have to do. It's meant to be a thought exercise for how do you actually turn a requirement into a process or a process step. So if there are questions, I'm happy to answer it. I know we're getting close to the end. So the floor is for the audience. Thank you.
Okay, Nick is correct. The slides and the recording of this webinar will be available shortly on the COSA website. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box at the right of your screen. And Nick, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I do have one question for you. And that is how do you get started with this, particularly if you're dealing with workflows that span more than one work group or work team? Any practical pointers?
Yeah, I think that the best way to get started is to really think about your requirements and sit down with your stakeholders and get them to do the same thing. So especially if you're working with a different records management team, a different IT team, that's real. That's what is probably the case in every state. But what needs to happen is have that meeting of the minds, have that information sharing, and have everybody talk about what's important to them, what they have to do, and why. Because a lot of the conflict and a lot of the places where these things break down is where IT has a requirement. We have a requirement to do X, but IT has a corresponding requirement that nobody does X, right? So who wins out in that situation? And that situation can never be solved by brute force. That situation has to be solved by finesse and compromise. And I know it's a little. It's a little weird to talk about compromise when we're talking about record keeping, because I think a lot of us, certainly part of my talk was that there are some hard and fast rules about how to preserve records and what is right and what is wrong. But ultimately, like I said, it's going to be a lot of do what you can do. And frankly, if you have the basics, I think, if you have the requirements down, if you have the fundamentals, what you should be caring about, there's no problem that you can't figure out a different way to solve, because it's not a matter of I need to use Microsoft. The question is, why do you need to use Microsoft, right? Why? I need to do checksums, but why? It's always that next step. I don't know. Hopefully that helps. I did see a question in there.
Yes, Nick, if you transfer your control over the slides to me, and
yes,
we just have one question, and that is, in what ways can you preserve original order in a public discovery system?
That's a good question. I think that's one of the hardest questions that we're going to deal with, because a lot of times what happens, and I'm sure you're aware of this, is records exist in context in some sort of productivity system, right? So if they're in SharePoint or one of those type of systems, in order to get them to you, they get extracted with metadata, hopefully, sometimes without metadata, right? Like put in a USB or put in a package, even using Bagger, you're really taking them out of their original environment and sending them along. So you're kind of breaking the original order already. And the truth is that I actually had a couple slides on this, but I cut them because, as you can see, we're already out of time. But essentially, when you're talking about computers, when you're talking about electronic data, we're really talking about a lot of different layers of abstraction. Ultimately, we are talking about bits on a disk, but that is presented through so many different, again, layers of abstraction through, your operating system, your software, your file format, etc. That what actually becomes, what is the actual truth? What is the actual record that we're looking at? And I don't have a good answer for that. I think that is a question that makes, frankly, not to wax poetic, but I think that's what makes being a digital archivist right now so interesting, is that it's not solved. But the advantage that we do have is we have the ability to virtualize the way that we present our information. And so just because you store records in one way, right, you have an OAIS compliant repository, and there's a pretty rigid way that you have to have submission information packages and archival information packages, et cetera. But how that you can use the abstraction to your advantage, you do not have to present it to your designated community in the same way. So if you know what the original order is, even if you don't preserve it, let's say technically, you can preserve it virtually, if that makes sense. And you can represent it virtually, I think. Again, easier said than done, though.
I'm not seeing any other questions, and it is 3 o'clock, so we will wrap things up. There are a few resources here that Nick has supplied, and these will be available on the slides. When you close this webinar window, you will see a brief evaluation open up. We encourage you to complete the evaluation. The Education and Programming Subcommittee really does pay close attention to the results of these evaluations, and we use them in planning webinar offerings. We also encourage you to stay connected and informed with COSA's website, Twitter handle, Facebook page, and YouTube page. As I mentioned at the start of this webinar, we will have more webinars are forthcoming, and we'll have a whole slew of videos coming your way in 2020. So, and with that, I'd like to wrap things up. Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you, everyone who attended, and enjoy the holidays.
Yep. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thanks